So which way is he most stable right now? With his weight all the way back, he's probably most stable going forward. So if someone was to come up behind him and give him a shove this way, if we look down at the foot, he has all of this space on the foot to compensate for this forward motion. So his weight can shift here, it can shift here, 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 all the way to his toes before he's out of compensating capacity from his base. So in one direction, he's quite stable from behind. If he's got his weight back on his heel, right, you could probably have a pretty good force. We're going to do a larger arrow to indicate the size of the force here. Pretty good force going this way, he can still compensate for it. Very small force going that way, but you almost can't even tell it's an arrow. A very small arrow, very small force going this way, he's already at the edge of his balance, so he's just going to topple right on over backwards. So we can definitely see why having your weight shifted all the way back to your heels is not a good idea. It creates more tension in the body than is necessary, and while it makes you somewhat more stable in one direction, it makes you way less stable in the other. And in a changing situation, in push hands, and even solo form training, that's not a great idea, because anything that disrupts the little bit of balance that he has at this point is very likely to take his balance the rest of the way out. Now let's consider the alternative. So his center of gravity, as we discussed in a previous video, is going to be somewhere around here, right? So in this area, that's going to be his lower dantian, right? Or his center of gravity, placeholder for his center of gravity. And of course, it might be a little higher than this, might be a little bit forward. It's in this general area. Right now we can see that his center of gravity, if we follow straight down, is pretty much right through his shin bone, his tibia here. So it's lined up exactly where he wants it to be for his body to be maximally stable, like we talked about a little bit earlier. So that's a good alignment. He would have to shift this back there, for his weight to be, or his center of gravity and his balance to be over his heel. So he's already, he's pushing this back this way, shifting his whole body back to line up over the heel. And if we consider what happens if he shifts his weight in the opposite direction, so let's say he brings his weight forward so that he can line it up right over the ball of his foot. So we're going to say that now his weight is over the ball of his foot. What has to happen for that to take place? Well, as you felt in the exercise, when you shift your weight forward and your weight gets over the ball of your foot has to engage quite a bit more. You'll notice that your toes kind of grip the ground even more. They're fighting that forward motion, trying to keep you from falling forward, which is a big part of why we have toes. But you notice that when you move from here, where you're in correct alignment over your foot, to moving forward, you have to engage more of your foot. You have to engage your calf muscle to try to fight this forward falling motion. So your foot's trying to push down into the floor harder, which engages the calf muscle. Typically this brings the knees forward more, so your knees are more likely to push out past the toes, which puts the knees in a much weaker position, and that's not ideal. And it's going to pull the leg forward. You're going to have more tension through the quad, trying to fight this bend of the knee that's happening as you're coming forward with this. It's trying to keep your body up straight here. And then you're going to find that your back tenses up more as you're going forward to try to fight this forward motion that's happening with the body. So your body's starting to do this to compensate for that motion. Muscles back here are tensing up, your quads are tensing up, your calves are tensing up, all the way through the bottom of the foot. All of this is engaging to keep this forward motion from costing you your balance. Now, an interesting thing that tends to happen here is as the body is shifting forward, sometimes what will happen is people will push their hips forward in that direction, and what that does is it pushes their upper body back in this direction. So then again they add tension up the top of their body and they end up leaning back like this. And they think that that is what the classics are referring to when it says to tuck the tailbone. And really what that's doing is it's pushing the hips forward and pushing the top back, so the body now has, it's moved forward but it's leaning back. So you have now overextension from the base going this way and overextension from the base going this way. So the body is not in alignment. It's actually engaging way more muscles here and here to try to maintain balance over a point that's not anatomically a good place to try to center your balance when standing. So now we can see why it's not a good idea to shift the weight forward toward the ball of the foot over that acupuncture point on the bottom of the foot, the Yongquan point, or the bubbling well point, or kidney 1, whatever you want to refer to it as. Putting your weight over that point is not really what that point's for, and it's kind of a misunderstanding that the body's weight should be centered over that point. We're not quite ready to get into that point yet, but we do want to talk about why it's not the place where you want to center your weight over that. And this is for the same reason. So we talked about before how when his weight was toward his heel, he could withstand a large force coming from the back, but a very small force coming from the front because he was already at such an extreme. And the same thing is true here in reverse. So with his weight forward on the ball of his foot, or on the Yongquan point, he has a lot of room going back this way to adjust and basically to make up for any large force coming in from the front. So anyone that pushes back on him, if his weight's up here, he has all this space back here where he can adjust if he starts to lose his balance from that force coming in. So if he starts here, he might be able to hold that, but if the force starts to increase more than he was expecting, he has some playroom to move back without going outside of his base of support here, and then he can recenter back where he's wanting his center of gravity. And that's what makes this point seem or appear to be really stable when people are practicing push hands, because in push hands you get a lot of force coming directly from your training partner coming in at you like this, and having that playroom from here all the way to the back of the foot to try to deal with that incoming force makes this feel very stable. But one way that you can tell that this is not a very stable spot is kind of the same way that we could tell that having the weight back here was not a stable spot. There's a lot of playroom for forces from the front, but not as much playroom for forces from the back. Now there's a little bit more because the toes can get involved and engaged, but it's still not very much playroom from the ball of the foot to the toes. And so a force coming from behind forward on this person is going to be much more likely to take their balance forward than a force coming from the front. So it has its strength from front pushes, but it's also weak from either a pulling force from the front or a push from behind, just like the heel was pretty strong for forces pushing from the back or pulling from in front, but very weak from forces that were pushing from the front or pulling from behind. And I really encourage you, if you have someone that you can safely practice push hands with, to try these weight distributions out in a push hand setting. If you don't have someone that you can practice with, then try pushing against a wall. You'll notice that when you're pushing against the wall, you can feel pretty stable pushing from your heel. You can feel pretty stable and powerful pushing from the ball of your foot. But in that static setting, it's really hard to tell where the weaknesses of these things are. So you can tell a bit. You can tell where tensions are in the body, where they kind of relax based on where your weight distribution is, where you can push more powerfully, where you don't have as much power when you push. All that stuff you can tell pushing against a wall. But if you bring a partner into the practice, then you'll see where the weakness comes in. So we're going to bring these guys back, and we're going to say that this guy is the one that we're focusing on, the guy in the darker clothing. And we're going to start with his weight back at his heels. So his weight's back here. Now that seems pretty stable, just kind of the way that he's standing here. It doesn't seem that terrible. But remember, he doesn't have as much space here. He has this very small space that he can recover any ground that he loses, any balance that he starts to lose, because all of his weight shifted to his heels. So he's going to be pretty strong if this guy pulls on him. And he's going to be able to compensate for that pull by using all the rest of his foot to make up for those pulls. So if this training partner gives a solid pull, he's probably going to be okay. But if the guy in the lighter clothing gives a quick pull and then a push, it's much more likely that he's going to upset this guy in the darker clothing's balance. And the reason is because he can't compensate going backwards because his weight is sitting back here. Even if this guy doesn't pull first and he just pushes forward, he's going to have a much harder time dealing with that forward force, and he's very likely to get pushed backwards and lose his balance backwards. So if you have someone that you can practice with, I highly recommend that you both get up and try this out. Have one person stand with their weight on their heels and the other person just give a push forward gently. And you don't even have to push that hard. If they keep their weight over their heels, it's going to be very easy for them to get pushed backwards. Now try pulling on them, and you're going to see that it's a lot easier for them to fight that pull when they started with their weight on their heels. Now let's switch over to this guy in the lighter clothing. He is of the school that believes that you want your weight directly below your Yongquan points, so his weight's forward on his feet like this. That's where he's focusing the weight of his body, the forces that are coming in during push hands practice. So now, as this guy in the dark clothing gives him a lot of push forward, this is going to come out and it's not going to do much because he's going to have a lot of space that he can use to compensate for that forward push. So this isn't going to do much. He can push all he wants. He's going to be pretty set with his weight forward. He's even going to be able to grip the ground, engage his calf muscles a little bit more, and have even more force that he can deliver forward, and also use to compensate for the force coming in from this guy. So he's going to seem really stable with this forward force that's coming in. However, with his weight forward on his toes, he doesn't have as much space that he can play with going forward. So if this guy is pushing, then he switches tactics and pulls forward, this guy's going to be very likely to go forward, and he's very likely to lose his balance. And that's something that I would encourage you to try with a partner as well, if you have someone that you can practice with. Try standing with your weight centered over the balls of your feet, and have them push on you. See how stable you feel. It's a very strong feeling stance from a forward push, but the problem is its weakness forward. So if they're pushing, and pull, and it's easy for them to pull you off balance, or almost easy for them to pull you off balance, if you lose your balance and have to fight and try really hard to regain that quickly, then you know that your balance wasn't really a centered central equilibrium balance. You just had the appearance of good balance and good structure, and it was really just kind of an overcompensation of how you were pushing from the balls of your feet. And one of the ways that you can tell if someone has a good root and they aren't overextending and they aren't putting their weight at less than ideal places on their feet is that when you have a push coming in at them, if you just let go immediately, if they fall forward, then what was happening was their weight was too far forward on their feet, and they were using that basically muscular force, and they were basically using a forward weight, pushing forward more than using their structure. So a lot more muscle was engaged, and they weren't well supported on their base, because when you let go quickly, they fall forward. Same thing's true if you're pulling and you're pulling and you're pulling, and they seem really solid, you can't get them to come forward, and then you switch and push and they go back really easily and just about fall over or do fall over, then you know that what was happening was it wasn't a good route. They were just fighting against what was going on. So now let's say this guy on the left here changes his tactic. He decides that he's going to put his weight directly below his shin bones into the floor. Okay, so right about there and right about there. Now, as we discussed before, any force coming forward, it has space all the way back to his heel. That is going to allow him to compensate for that if his frame was not set up to withstand it. His root has some playroom. If this guy changes and pulls forward, well, there's space for that too. He has all that space going forward that he can compensate for pulling forces. So even though his weight is centered here, if he starts to get pulled a little bit off of that spot where he wants his weight, he can make up for it, and there's a little bit of room for him to play and then work on getting back to that spot. Same with going backwards. A little bit of room to play, and then he can work on getting back to that spot. He's not right at the edge, either to the front or to the back, where a sudden change in direction is going to completely mess up his root. So now you can start to see why it's really important where your weight is centered over your foot. Now, their feet are completely in contact with the floor, but where they shift their weight on the foot, even though the whole foot's in contact, if it's at the back, it's a problem. If it's at the front, it's a problem. And you can see why this is important in a push hand situation, but let's talk a little bit about why it's important in solo form training. As we talked about in this picture, when the weight shifts forward,